تست تست تست.
نشتاق للثورات هدي وتبني هدي وتبني الدنيا بمصر. نشتاق للثورات هدي وتبني هدي وتبني الدنيا بمصر. عنوان البيت من غير عنوان في الدنيا الواسعة وكل مكان. عنوان البيت من غير عنوان في الدنيا الواسعة وكل مكان. هتلاقوا كتير عش وعصافير تعشقوا الطير فوق الأحزان. 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 هتلاقوا كتير عش
Good evening. My name is Thomas Wilshire. I'm the new Executive Director of the American University in Cairo Press, which is pleased to be hosting tonight's event. When I say that I am new, that is literal, as I just arrived in Cairo from my former home in New York City barely 3 weeks ago. One of the compelling reasons for coming so far to take on this role was the opportunity to live in Egypt. The move has given me the opportunity to grow by experiencing another society firsthand and to see my own from a new perspective. I'm proud to be leading a press that publishes books that help illustrate how culture and lived experience inform each other. None more so than the book that is the subject of tonight's event, which, as its title suggests, is a masterful depiction of how art and struggle can combine to create something that, while born in turmoil, is also joyful and resilient. The book, Palestinian Music in Exile, Voices of Resistance, was published less than a year ago and has already received acclaim in the trade and scholarly press in the Middle East, as well as in North America and Europe. It has been called a towering achievement and essential reading that provides context and texture to current world events, and a compelling narrative that not only informs but also inspires a deeper appreciation for the resilience and creativity of Palestinian musicians in exile. Louis Brehony is an activist, musician, researcher, and educator, and a scholar of Palestinian music. He is the director of an award-winning documentary film, Kofia, A Revolution Through Music, and is published widely on Palestine and political culture. He received his PhD from King's College London and a master's in composition from the University of Salford. As you are about to see, as you're about to see and hear, he is also a multi-instrumentalist. He co-founded his musical band, Gazelle Band, with Palestinian oud player and music therapist Reem Anbar, his wife. The members of Gazelle Band tell the Palestinian story through music and recently ended their world tour of 15 cities and 7 countries. He has family origins in Ireland and has lived in Manchester, UK, and like me, he's now a resident of Cairo. It's with great pleasure that I ask you all to join me in welcoming to the Oriental Hall at the American University of Cairo, Dr. Louis Brehony.
Thank you for that warm introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book this evening, and hopefully with an opportunity for discussion. I'm hoping not to speak for too long and give you guys a chance to give my voice a rest and maybe ask some questions, etc. I hope you'll excuse the fact that my presentation is not drawn completely from this text, because obviously events in Palestine and particularly in Gaza over the last, well, nearly a year have really drawn the world's eyes upon the Palestinian confrontation. And I think that the Palestine as a site of music making, of culture, I think is increasingly and arguably more relevant than ever. So I'm going to refer a little bit to events, musical and cultural events in Gaza also, with a little bit of a preview, I would say, of some future publications. So for those of you that don't know, the book is comprised of a number of chapters, of which I will not go through in great detail. Hopefully you'll read them yourself if you have not already. But it really is a kind of a geographical tour of Palestinian exile. And it goes from, for example, the Palestinian experience in Kuwait, particularly from after 1967, Palestinian experiences of making music in Bilad al-Sham, in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. In Egypt, so there is a chapter about Tamer Abu Ghazala, who spent most of his music-making life in Egypt. On Turkey, so a bunch of Ghazawi or Gazan exiles in Turkey that formed musical ensembles. And Palestine itself. So Edward Said, in one of his seminal texts, reminds us that Palestine is exile. So to talk about exile, we're not just talking about the expulsion of Palestinians beyond Palestine, but to the expulsion of Palestinians within Palestine. And I hesitated a moment ago to use the word Ghazawi, Gazan. Actually, there's a section in one of the 2 chapters about Gaza in the book, which is entitled Ana mish Ghazawi, I am not a Gazan. So this is a really important thing to recognize, that those displaced in Gaza were already displaced. You know, they are from further afield in historic Palestine. So it's with Gaza that I would like to begin this presentation, really. Beginning on the note that I think, you know, we have to recognize what is ongoing, the genocide in Gaza and the resistance in Gaza. And the fact that musicians and artists are among and are actually embedded in the communities which are under this vicious attack. So among the first artistic and musical martyrs are the 4 figures on the left: Omar Abu Shawish, Mahmoud al-Jabiri, Heba Zakut, the artist, and Ines al-Saqqa, who is a theatre director and theatre therapist. And the musicians that remained in Gaza throughout this genocide, until about 6 weeks ago, the members of Firqat Sol Band were all, apart from one, were all in Gaza. They've since left, you know, before the recent seizure of the Rafah border by the Zionist forces. And musicians that remain in Gaza. So I don't know if people have seen the face or the outplaying of the young Samih Madhoun. Really inspirational. You know, he's playing in the tents, he's singing with the children, and producing music to keep the spirits up, you know, in spite of this horrific siege. Now, music making has been a central theme, I would say, of this confrontation in different ways. And I want to begin by speaking about how music has been used in the Palestinian case since October 2023. The image on the left is the Dahdouh family. Wa'il Dahdouh is the famous Al Jazeera journalist, currently in Qatar, I believe. Most of the family members in this image were martyred soon after the image was taken. But this is from a video of his family singing the song Baktub Ismik Ya Biladi around the campfire. So they had been displaced from their homes, I believe in Nusayrat camp, and were gathering in the evening to sing this song, Baktub Ismik Ya Biladi. So this was originally a Lebanese song. It was written by a singer called Ali Shweri in the early 1970s to describe his ghurba, his estrangement from Lebanon when he was traveling. And actually it's analyzed and discussed in the book, in the memories of a woman who grew up in Gaza in the first Intifada after 1987 as a young woman and as a teenager and then a young woman, who describes this song as being like a thread that connected to her to Palestinian history. So interesting that the same songs are still sung in Gaza today. Another song which appeared within the first weeks almost of this onslaught was Sofa Nabqa Huna. It was not written by a Palestinian. It was, I think he's Lebanese, Adil Mashiti. He's not Lebanese, sorry, Libyan. And if you saw the video at the time, there was a group of doctors on the steps of Al-Auda Hospital in late November, all dressed in doctor uniforms, you know, health workers. And they'd come out onto the steps to sing this song, Sofa Nabqa Huna, we will remain here. And it was, I think, a really poignant moment. The video that I'm just about to play, it's a very, very short clip. This is from Abu Maher. So Abu Maher is a father of 3 in Gaza City. The video was before their house was destroyed. They are still there in Gaza City, within a couple of square kilometers from where their house was destroyed. And one of the ways that he decided to keep the spirits of the children up was to sing this song. I'll just play a very short clip.
قاعدين مش متزحزحين منها يلا
سوف نبقى هنا كي يزول الألم سوف نحيا هنا سوف يحلو النغم موطني موطني موطني.
So just a short clip of Abu Maher and his children singing this song, سوف نبقى هنا. He says something that you can barely hear at the beginning of the clip. He says in a very Ghazawi accent, he says, قاعدين مش مزحزحين. We're not moving. And this has been his kind of personal position, this kind of sumud-like position throughout the confrontation.
قاعدين مش متزحزحين.
Trying to get on to the next slide. Here we go. Now, I've discussed Palestinian music, and this is my kind of specialty before and since producing this book. There's been, over the years, I would say, just over 20 years, in fact, of interest academically in Palestinian music. There's been pressure from various academics and people at different times. So why are you not talking about Israeli music? If you're talking about Palestinian music, why not talk about the Israeli side also? And this is something that I have always resisted and continue to resist. However, I think recent events have made me look at things slightly differently, and I'll explain why. Partly motivated by the same reasons that the great Ghassan Kanafani was motivated by in the 1960s when he produced this text, Fil Adab al-Sahyuni, on Zionist literature. He said that his purpose in writing this text and studying Zionist literary fiction and other works of literature was to understand the enemy, to understand the motives and the reasoning that they gave behind their colonization. So, as part of a presentation that I did at the University of Edinburgh a couple of months ago, and I'm intending to publish this, was to gather examples of, let's say, Israeli music or Zionist musical iterations since the 7th of October. Couple of examples on the screen in front of you. So there was a song produced with the seemingly very innocent title by a group of Israeli singers on Israeli children on an Israeli TV channel. The song was called Song of Friendship. Doesn't that sound really nice? Well, the lyrics were openly genocidal. We will annihilate everybody in Gaza and so on. You know, it was a really kind of disgusting thing to see these young children brainwashed in this way. And then the performance, I thought this image was quite interesting because you see the qanun, which is an Arab and Turkish instrument, but being performed by occupation troops. And the guy with the microphone, he's not a singer, he's introducing the band, so he's an army pastor. And among the words that he says was that we will reclaim Gaza as though it is theirs to reclaim, and we will even reclaim Lebanon, which is quite interesting in the context of what we see. So alongside the Palestinians using music as a form of resistance and resilience and sumud throughout of these months, there has also been this parallel use and abuse of music by the occupation itself. And I think that is worthy of attention, really, to understand it in the same way that Ghassan Kanafani understood that literature. Now here is a Palestinian perspective. So this is Faris Ambar. He's one of the members of Sol Band, so he's currently in Istanbul. He was in Gaza until about 2 months ago. So he created a little bit of a diary about his experiences as a displaced Palestinian in Gaza. He said, "I had not slept until this moment. Bombs from the east, west, south and north did not stop firing at us all kinds of weapons. A party with the world's #1 DJ, Israel, and the party's financier, the Arab world and the Europeans, and the primary beneficiary, the United States." So to describe this in musical terms was quite interesting. Remaining with Gaza, so this is actually from the book, and again there's a Kanafani link. You may see the hint of the interest in Ghassan Kanafani, which I might return to later. These lyrics to his Rimh, Shake the Spear, actually appeared in his monumental study, I would say, of the 1936 to 39 Palestinian Revolution, his Rimh Bi'oud al-Zain, which it was a wedding song. It's associated with weddings, but it is infused with the political lyrics of the battles of historic Palestine. And the reason that I wrote about this song is connected to the band that you see on the screen. This is Firqat Dawaween, and the female singer in the middle, Rowan Orkasha, who remains in Gaza currently. In fact, the theatre that they're performing on has been destroyed, along with many others. And she described her taking to the stage as a Palestinian singer and the kind of empowerment that enabled as a young woman, and why she wanted to connect to this heritage of resistance song. I'm going to play a short excerpt from this piece, and then I'll talk a little bit more. This instrument, before anybody asks, is called the buzuq. The melody to his Rimh, a Palestinian folk song, wedding song, resistance song. And it was sung by Rowan Orkasha during this period in the mid, let's say, the teens, right around about 2015, 2016 was when this band was together. She was actually pregnant at the time, and she appeared on stage, again, describing the kind of exuberance of taking to the stage in Gaza. There's a very interesting article in the New York Times, which I discuss in the book, in the second chapter about Gaza. The name of the chapter, by the way, is Ahla Ayyam, the most beautiful days. And this was a description of a young Palestinian of the times during the second Intifada in Gaza. So despite the kind of horrific bloodshed, Ahla Ayyam, people were coming together and making music. And Rowan describes making music in Palestine in similar terms during that period. Of course, this harks back to earlier periods of Palestinian music making, whether it is music making that is directly linked to the resistance, the armed resistance, and otherwise, and to music to preserve the heritage of historic Palestine. Recently, we've seen examples of that. So these artworks, so on the left by Bisan Arafat, and produced after the 7th of October last year, and Rola Azar, who's been really active in the months since. She produced a song immediately after October the 7th called Ajras al-Auda, the Bells of Return. So the kind of thread of music making and resistance and politics in historic Palestine has really continued in the face of and despite everything that is thrown at the people of Gaza. Now, the front cover of the book, Palestinian Music in Exile, was actually an artistic rendering by an artist called Samir Harb, based in Germany and from a village in the West Bank originally. And the artist on the cover, just probably uncoincidentally, actually is the brother of Rowan Orkasha, who we just saw, Mohammed Orkasha, the oud player. And he performed, the image was from a photograph in the rubble here. He's not in this picture, this is another band. So in August 2018, the Zionist state essentially destroyed the Said al-Mashal Theatre in central Gaza. And immediately, the day after, the youth came to the street to perform in the rubble. So Mohammed Orkasha, the band Autar al-Shara, performed in the rubble. And this has become a repeating theme. So we see, for example, Soul Band, who I've already mentioned, Muhannad al-Ashram in Gaza, with a destroyed instrument, by the way. So this idea of, you may bomb our homes, you may destroy our theatres and community centres, but our music, our cultural resistance and our cultural belonging to Palestine does not go away. In fact, no, we are keen to come out and present that. By the way, Autar al-Shara, Strings of the Street, was the original name of the text. I'm glad we chose this name, but I think that bringing those strings onto the streets is quite a kind of a symbolic act. And it is also an act of sumud. So in the kind of review process of this book and in various discussions in academic fields over the last few years, I've come up against, and I think probably other people have come up against the idea that, sumud, steadfastness, it's dated, it doesn't have any relevance. And I think this is kind of from a Western academic perspective. But what I've really tried to do in kind of theorizing the book and in framing it is to return to the idea of sumud as a form of resistance and as something relevant. So I won't read the big quote here from Lina Ma'ari, whose study of the sumud as a confrontation among Palestinian political prisoners in the prison regime. I would definitely recommend reading her work, but I also refer to that in the introductory chapter of the book as well. Speaking of prisoners and speaking of sumud, I'll explain the images in front of us. Now, this is referred to, on the left, is referred to in the concluding chapter of the book and then appeared in another essay that I wrote after the book was had gone to press. The name of that essay is Genius in the People. So this on the left is a replica of an ode made inside Gilboa prison. So Gilboa is the famous, the prison where a group of Palestinians famously launched this audacious escape with spoons. It was also the prison in which Fida Eshar, a Syrian political prisoner in an Israeli jail, and an oud player and a musician, joined his cellmates, his comrades on the inside in producing this oud. Now, they found scrap wood from chess sets, shataranj, from old boxes. This is slightly different. He said that he used a broom handle to make the neck of the oud. They even found a way of processing or cooking glue in the prison kitchen in order to make glue out of rice. And the only thing that they were forced to kind of smuggle in from the outside was the strings. So he said they did that hidden in the seams of clothing. They managed to sneak them in. So this was a collectively produced instrument inside the cell. Of course, when the Zionist prison guards found it, they took it away, just like they'd confiscated his original oud when they arrested him. They took it away, and then the prisoners decided to make another one. The reason why I have an image of Walid Da'a, who was martyred earlier this year in a Zionist prison. For those who don't know, he was the longest serving Palestinian political prisoner since the mid-1980s, and he died of cancer, but he was refused treatment for that cancer. So how he comes into this story is when the Zionist prison guards uncovered this oud and found it in the prison cell. Walid Da'a basically stood up and said, "It was me, I did it," and basically took the blame of this collective work, which was led by Fida Eshar, and took the consequences of that. So Walid was thrown into another prison. He was thrown into solitary confinement. He was fined by the prison authorities. So he really kind of stood up and in this kind of act of collective solidarity, stood up for his comrades. Instruments themselves, I think, are really important. And one of the points that I make in the book at various points is that although Palestinian music is an inescapably vocal tradition, it is linked to poetry, is orally passed down from generation to generation, and even the lyrics are passed down, over the decades and centuries. Instruments, I think, also play an important role in defining what Palestinians are in different places of displacement. So a few examples from the book. In southern Lebanon, a young group of shabab pick up the bagpipes, which was an instrument left, or the form of bagpipes left by the Scottish British troops who left them in Palestine when they occupied Palestine. Other musicians picked up the oud. the central music instrument in Arab music historically. Others picked up the guitar or keyboards or the ney or the mijwiz. So the instrument is, I think, really important and symbolic. The oud itself, I think, is really important, and there has been a move in recent years among the Israeli cultural establishment to try and claim the oud as being somehow Israeli. You know, the same way they want to claim the hummus and the falafel as Israeli, or the tatriz. They want to try and claim the oud as Israeli, and there is an oud festival that until recently happened every October in occupied Jerusalem, and they tried their best to get Arab musicians to play, but it was always usually Israeli musicians, and there was a boycott campaign, of course. I want to play another short piece in a minute. This is a little bit different. This is more in the Arab classical tradition, and I learned of this piece from Palestinian Syrian guitarist Tariq Salhiya, who lives in Damascus still. And he describes a situation in Syria in the summer of 2013, where, in his words, the war had gotten really ugly. You know, they were essentially under siege conditions, and in his words, it felt like the whole world was at war in Syria. And what he did in that situation of siege in Damascus, where they couldn't leave their house, was that he did a little bit of research into kind of old music notation that he could find, and learned some new pieces that he would then come out and perform after the end of this siege, which he did. And one of the pieces that he discussed was called Sama'i Ajam al-Khammash. If you're not a musical person, the Sama'i is a musical form which, by the way, the Egyptians totally mastered. It was originally a Turkish form, but it was used by other Arab composers. Ajam is the maqam, the scale. Al-Khammash is the name of the composer. So this is Rouhi al-Khammash, who was a Palestinian musician and composer who spent most of his life in Iraq, certainly after the Nakba. So much so, in fact, that when you meet an Iraqi musician, they try to claim that Rouhi al-Khammash is Iraqi. He was not, he was Palestinian. So I'm going to play a short piece, short section of this piece, Sama'i Ajam al-Khammash. So moving on. So I'm glad that the introduction referred to the idea of joy in Arabic farah through culture, through music, and I think despite or perhaps because of everything that has been witnessed upon the Palestinian people is, I think, really essential, and this is really described in many ways by different musicians, but I like this quote from Reem. She said that how we dance at weddings, plough the earth, catch fish, our music and songs are not about sadness. And this was in response to a British academic asking her, So isn't all Palestinian music sad music? Well, of course it's not. You know, this is the song, the music of weddings, of dance, of every Palestinian munasaba. What's the English? Event. Thank you. So, and through that, I think the connections that the Palestinians and Palestinian music makes to the wider Arab world, I think is optimistic. So not only does Palestinian music, or a lot of Palestinian music at least, carry this idea of farah and joy, but it's also overwhelmingly optimistic. So the lyrics, for example, of the Rahbani brothers sung by Fairuz after 1967 were in total contradistinction to the music produced by the Zionists after 1967, which was all about colonization. It was all about how we return the people, the life, the peace to cities like Jerusalem. Of course, I think there are many Egyptian and Palestinian connections. The piece that was playing as you came in is a little-known song called Anwan al-Bayt, which was written by Ahmed Fuad Negim and sung by George Kirmiz, who's a Palestinian guitarist and songwriter, where you can read about in the book. And of course, Egypt itself and Egyptian musicians have made many contributions to solidarity with the Palestinian people, not least people like Sheikh Imam. By the way, the book on the right was released in English for the first time last year. It's been available in Arabic for some time by Wissam Rafidi. Wissam Rafidi is a former Palestinian political prisoner and activist based in the West Bank. And it's a novel basically based on his time in hiding as a political activist in Palestine. And so he was essentially unable to leave the house. You know, he would have his comrades visit him, you know, that such was the security situation. And he describes the people that kept him company. You know, occasionally his mother would visit him and bring him mahshi or etc. But he describes what he calls my revolutionary sheikh. So Sheikh Imam playing the cassettes, the sharits of the time, was really helped him build his spirits and, you know, maintain his revolutionary position. So here's a little bit of the well-known Ya Falastiniya by Sheikh Imam.
فلسطينية والبندقان رماك وبالصهيونية تقتل حمامكم حماك يا فلسطينية والبندقان رماك وبالصهيونية تقتل حمامكم حماك يا فلسطينية وانا بدي اسافر حيداك ظهري بايديا وايديا تنزل معاكم على راس الحية وتموت شريعتونك ويا
We could listen to that, but I think we're running out of time. I just want to refer quickly, I referred earlier on to Ghassan Kanafani. So kind of the theoretical framing of Palestinian music in exile is based on Marxism, and an unheard Marxism of people like Ghassan Kanafani, Layla Khaled, and their comrades. And what was really an outgrowth of this project and the project Imagining Palestine by Professor Tahrir Hamdi. We got to know each other while writing our own books. We basically came together because we realized we'd both used the works of Ghassan Kanafani in different ways. And so my second book is about to be released by Pluto Press in Britain, Selected Political Writings, which is a translation text involving many different translators and contributors. So I think I will leave things there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments or contributions. Thank you.
If you have any questions, just raise your hands and we're going to get you the mic. Any questions? Don't be shy, guys. Any questions you would like to ask? By the way, also, if you're comfortable, Luis does speak Arabic, so if you want to ask something in Arabic, he'll gladly answer it for you.
برد بالفلسطيني مش المصري للأسف.
بالظبط. We always have questions. أنت عندك؟
الله يعافيك.
Thank you for playing these songs. I have a question. My friend sent me 2 questions. Actually, the first one. Yeah, thank you. How do you believe Palestinian music has shaped or reflect the border resistance movements? Do you think are there any particular genre or artists that stand out in this region?
Yeah, I don't know how to interpret that question. The broader resistance movement, are we talking about here? Are we talking about in the whole world? I think one way, I think quite interestingly, that the Palestinian music and Palestinian resistance has influenced cultural movements. I mean, there's a well-known song that came to light again recently called Levi Palestina, which was written in Swedish, Levi Palestina or Tahia Palestine in Arabic. It was written by George Totari, who was a singer with the Kofia group in Sweden after 1967. And I know George quite well. I produced a little film about him. I'm not really a filmmaker, by the way. And I remember a couple of years ago, he was kind of this depressed kind of old guy. He was I can't contribute anymore, I'm tired, we need new people to pick up the flame. But then with the protest movement after October last year, thousands upon thousands of people in Sweden and beyond started singing this song again, Levi Palestina, which was written in 1975-ish, yeah, and recorded then. And then it suddenly came back again 40 years later, and then George is suddenly on Arab TV, he's on European TV. It's almost as though the movement gave life back to an old Palestinian activist, and he had given life to that movement. So it was this kind of exchange. That's one example that I can think of, but there are probably others.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. May I have another question? Thank you. Actually, it's my friend, and she couldn't able to attend today. Yes. The second question is, I'm trying to read her question, actually. I'm trying to read the next one, I'm sorry. Palestinian music often carries a sense of culture preservation. How do contemporary artists balance harmony, traditional music, with the innovating and adapting to global influences?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because quite a few people have quite rightly focused, for example, on rap music and electronic music, and that it would be true to say that many Palestinian rap artists or electronic artists are pioneers and travel the world and influence many people. And I think that it's a really significant thing that Palestinians are able to do that when their own industry is systematically underdeveloped by Zionist colonization. At the same time, there are those Palestinians that respond in the opposite way, not by innovation but by preservation. So, for example, there's a young Nai player in southern Lebanon, in Burj al-Shamali camp, called Bahat Jum'ah, and he plays traditional instruments, and he plays what he describes as anti-electronic music. So they refuse to use electronic instruments because they want to preserve this instrument that is made from the wood, from the land, that is connected to Palestinian history. So there are all these strands, and then you meet musicians that are seemingly in between. So the electro debka artist, so Shafiq Kabhai was a very well-known Palestinian wedding singer. He produced thousands of cassettes, toured widely at weddings in Palestine. Now his music and many of his followers would describe him as being a traditionalist. He was singing songs from before the Nakba and before the time of the Ottoman Empire, etc. but he was performing it alongside these wild keyboard solos and this electronic kind of drum beat kind of style. So at the same time, even those that claim to be preserving, there are innovations that creep in that I think influence other people.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Lewis.
Yes, hello. I want to thank you for your intervention and explaining about your book. I have more question about more your approach or methodological aim that you have. Is more kind of anthropological, historical, artistical point of view that you connected your research?
Yeah, thank you. Interesting question. I'll go to the point that I make in the book in a moment. I think for myself, I always came into this as a listener, first of all. I've always been a musician for as long as I can remember. And there was a certain point as a teenager when I was kind of led to listen to what was called in the West world music, which could mean anything. It could mean Indian music or South American music or African music. And then at the same time, kind of in parallel to this kind of music exploration, I became an activist. Like many young people in Europe, I was kind of radicalized by the Iraq War in 2003 and the fact that Britain as an imperialist power was performing this same historic role in oppressing people worldwide. And to me, at a certain point, I think putting the two together of political education and being a musician and being into culture. The point that I make at the end of the first chapter is the idea of positionality. All academics talk about positionality. You're supposed to, your PhD supervisor or your editor will encourage you to say, well, you need to talk about your own position. You are from this place, and what gives you the right to speak about this, this, and this. And many people, I think, would write entire essays on their positionality. It's another made-up word, I think, by academia, really. I don't see myself really as, this is an academic press, and whisper it between these walls, but I don't really see myself as an academic in that sense, in the traditional sense. I think, it might be, I don't hope it doesn't sound pompous to say this, but I see my work as an act of solidarity, a contribution, I hope. And I make the point that if this work in one way or even in the tiniest way draws people to listen to this music and to research and to reach out to the musicians themselves, then I think, it will be a job well done. But, I'm at the same time modest about what this can really achieve.
First of all, congratulations on the amazing work. My question is about preserving the legacy of the music. Is there an archive, a foundation that supports such works, global or local? How does this music come to the world and be preserved for the next generations amongst this genocide?
Thank you. Important question, I think, the idea of the archive, and it links to things like the war in Iraq and what happened to the Iraqi archives and cultural artifacts. It links back to the Nakba and what happened to the Palestinian cultural archives in the Nakba, many of which are still under lock and key in Zionist military archives. There is no central archive of Palestinian music. You go to the West Bank to a place called Al-Bira, which is near Ramallah. There is what is called the Cultural Arts Center. They have dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of cassettes and recordings, many of it, unavailable anywhere else. But they really struggle. They don't have the funding or the the political will under the Palestinian Authority to make that, to protect it in the way that it should be protected. And I think that situation has led many Palestinians to become kind of archival activists themselves, which carries its own dangers. There are many people out there that, really seek to preserve these recordings, these artifacts, whether it's videos of old Palestinian TV, whether it's recordings of old Palestinian musicians. But then something like the current genocide happens and, that is totally threatened. So, for example, there is, I can give two examples. So Fadi Abdel Hadi is a cultural archiver in Gaza, and quite early in the recent onslaught, his home and his archive was bombed, so he lost, a lot of that material. Another Fadi in southern Lebanon, Fadi Zaraqit, his home has not been bombed. He lives in Sur in southern Lebanon, and he's another collector of all of this material. But he is currently, he describes a situation where every day or every other day his family has to leave the house. They don't know whether the house is going to be bombed. And can they take all of these materials with them? Well, no. If their house in Sur is bombed, they lose everything. So I think really the fight against the war becomes a fight to preserve this and protect it. And maybe there are things that can be done in the West where, we live in relative privilege to preserve those things, but many of these artifacts are still in Palestine and around Palestine.
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and for a book that helps spread Palestinian music and culture in a way. And that brings me to my question. How well spread is Palestinian music as a culture? I don't mean Palestinian singers per se, but as a culture currently. How well spread is it geographically? Because for me, I think that besides music being an act of sumud and a preservation of one's identity, it also promotes my thoughts, the culture, the people's thoughts. So currently, how well spread is it?
Thank you. A very difficult question. I think it could take quite a while to answer, but I'll try and keep it short. I think the question leads back to how well spread are the Palestinian people, because I think in every example of Palestinian displacement and every example of Palestinian ghurba, whether it is here in Egypt or in Turkey or in Europe or in South America, there are examples of Palestinian musicianships. And I think more often than not, that musicianship is connected to a kind of activism. It's a conscious thing. We're doing this because we want to promote it to the people around us, and we want to also preserve it, like you said. But I think the question of Palestinian music, I think, is a difficult one. In fact, some may disagree with the title of the book, Palestinian Music in Exile. It could be music of Palestinians in exile. But what is Palestinian music, for instance? Is Palestinian music a guy in Damascus playing a Western classical guitar? Is Palestinian music a guy playing the nai in southern Lebanon? I think it means different people to different things to different people in different locations in different periods. And I focused on the Middle East really because the series was called Refugees in the Middle East, and AUC kind of didn't push me, but kind of molded that direction, yeah. But equally, there are Palestinian musicians in Brazil who perform dabka, perform Palestinian vocal arts, and perform on instruments like the bouzouki, the oud. Or in Britain, we have Palestinian musicians that tour and perform. And they are not all of the same kind of music, and they're not all of the same generation. And I think sometimes where you grow up really influences that. Quite interestingly, the tastes of Palestinians in Gaza are, I think, noticeably different to the tastes of Palestinians elsewhere. So in Jerusalem or parts of the West Bank, where kind of the techno scene or the electronic scene or the rap scene have really kind of taken ground, they exist in Gaza as well. But I think there is more of a trend among youth to kind of what you might see as a kind of, some people might see it as a conservatism, but I kind of see it more as trying to retrace that lost thread with historic Palestine. So why play music by this oud player, Ruhi al-Khammash, who performed in Palestine before the Nakba, for example? Well, I think that part of that is to assert the fact that the oud has always been in Palestine, or has been in Palestine at least for the period before Zionist colonization. So rebuilding that thread, I think, is a noticeable thing among the Palestinians that grew up in Gaza. Some people have observed the linguistic trend in Gaza is quite conservative. You know, it's a country under siege. Therefore, the language has not been westernized as much as the West Bank or in historic Palestine. I think a similar thing you could observe through music.
Hello. Oh, that's loud. Thank you very much for your talk and activism and scholarship in general. I'm really interested in your focus on instruments and instrumentality. And I was curious about this picture you put up of there's an Anun player behind this man who's saying, "This is our land." And you mentioned that this is an Arab and Turkish instrument. And so there's some kind of paradox or irony or something going on there. So I wondered if you could talk about that more, and also the idea that so often music and musical instruments are used as a way of finding like common ground or mutual understanding or setting aside political differences. And there's a lot that has happened in the Zionisty and occupied Palestine. But it's also interesting that instruments, in your experience, have been used so much as a marker of resistance and identity, of a way of distinguishing cultural difference and background. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about these ideas. Thank you.
Two difficult questions in one. Thank you. In terms of the first one, I think it's quite interesting that the way that Israeli culture is presented to the world. For example, I'm not sure if it's probably not the same here in Egypt, but in London, if you want to go and buy a book or learn about Middle East cuisine, one of the first authors that will come up is a famous Israeli chef who presents the culture of the Middle East, and he is this towering figure. He's the authority on Middle East food. A guy that served in the Israeli army, but now has become probably the most famous Middle Eastern chef in Europe, Ottolenghi. I think that it's quite an interesting phenomenon. I think what the Zionist cultural establishment aims to do is multipolar in a sense, because on one hand they want to present themselves as being in some way European and therefore modern and therefore worthy of entry into things like the Eurovision Song Contest or the UEFA Football Champions League and things like that. Not that their teams are ever good enough, but and then on the other hand, to try and kind of claim ownership or try and claim heritage in the land that they colonize. And it doesn't just happen through music, it happens through language. You can read people like Joseph Massad and Ilan Pappé who discuss how the names even of Israeli politicians were taken from this kind of form of Hebrew which was kind of manufactured in the period leading up to the Nakba in order to kind of create this new language of colonization. And so they would therefore reject their European last names and take on something that sounded more, connected to the region. It happens through music, and I think the Oud Festival I've mentioned as one example is really important and a kind of a flashpoint in Palestinians and others fighting back and saying, no, the Oud is an Arab instrument, it is connected to our culture. But then at the same time, it has to be recognized that some of those who colonized the land of Palestine are Arabs. There are Iraqi Zionists, Moroccan Zionists, and as well as being Ukrainian and Russian and US and so forth. So there is a kind of a history there, that some could claim rightfully as a connection to that part of the Arab world. But they do not want to claim, they do not want to openly assert that it is Arab, that it is Arab culture. They want to say that it is Israeli culture and therefore connect it to this myth that Israel has this right to be there, to continue and to sustain itself at the expense of others. And the question, going on to your second question about, there's a book that comes to mind called Playing Across a Divide by a scholar called Benjamin Brehony. And this is, so he's a US / Israeli ethnomusicologist, and his whole argument is for, let's say, peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. Well, on the surface, that sounds quite nice. But then when you get into the text itself, that the kind of coexistence that he argues for is one that rejects any representation or expression of Palestinian culture, or the fact that Palestinians are a nation. I mean, even the Palestinian musicians that you might see as the least political, Simon Shaheen, for example, in the United States, the oud player, quite over the years he's been at pains to distance himself from any politics related to Palestine, but he's attacked scurrilously by this guy Benjamin Brinner as a guy who, well, you know, he couldn't live with the Israeli cultural establishment, therefore he left, you know. So there is this kind of push by a section, not just of academia, but the Israeli cultural establishment, for Palestinians to cleanse themselves as anything but Israeli Arabs or second-class citizens, and accept that citizenship as the basis for let's hold hands and have peace. Where, you know, I think that there are other arguments for how cultural cooperation might take place, but certainly not on this basis, I don't think.
First, thank you for your wonderful talk, and congrats on your presentation. I just have one question. I was wondering to what extent the Palestinian music is powerful to prove that this culture, this music, this tradition belongs to Palestinian people, and it's part of the Middle East. You were talking about instruments, about music, about patterns. It looks so familiar. It's belong to this kind of people. We are so familiar with those people. But this music and this kind of phenomena was powerful enough to prove this truth. And to I just was wondering if that music was powerful enough to affect or maybe change the international perspective and the people who have the power to make decision and make difference regarding to the current status in Gaza and West Bank. I just was wondering to what extent this music is powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting question. I hope we all feel that this music is powerful intrinsically, but I want to refer back to a quote that I didn't really refer to from Ghassan Kanafani, where he said that cultural resistance is essential and no less important than the armed resistance itself. Now, Ghassan Kanafani was a novelist. He was also a leading member of the PFLP, the Jabha Sha'biya, the Tahrir Palestine, and he argued for the armed struggle as the main goal, the main method by which Palestine would be liberated. But he wrote these novels, he produced all of these literary works, and here I think he is placing the cultural contribution of Palestinians and their supporters, I would say, on the same plane as the movement for liberation. So I think one cannot happen without the other. I think that is, on the kind of opposite perspective, a recognition of the fact that culture in itself is not enough. It needs this armed resistance, but then this armed resistance is not enough, it needs culture. And I think it would be correct to see music as one aspect, one very important aspect, I would argue, in a palette which includes all kinds of Palestinian cultural contributions, you know, Palestinian film, Palestinian dance, Palestinian cookery, Palestinian clothing, poetry, novels, you know. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was because, you know, that you can easily go and find a book about Palestinian literature or Palestinian cooking, but music, it seemed like, you know, there was not so much there to learn about. So I think, you know, to place those different cultural strands together into this fist, which appears alongside the fist of the physical resistance, I think is the strategy that Kanafani argued for, and I think I would agree with.
We're just going to take one last question, if that's okay.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask about the use of the word exile in the title. I think you mentioned a little bit about the title before, but so is the exile kind of like because there aren't many Palestinian voices coming from within Palestine itself, or is that because you kind of consider that those coming from inside are also partly in exile?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you, at the very beginning of my talk, I mentioned the Edward Said quote where he says Palestine is exile. So I think part of the recognition and part of the reason I've got 2 chapters about Gaza and one about a historic village in Palestine is the recognition of the fact that internal exiles are part of that. But actually, the word exile, we could probably have a linguistic discussion about it and where it comes from. In the introduction, I referred to the word ghurba. Now, the word ghurba could mean estrangement or something different to exile. Exile, you could say what, ashatat or manfiya. You know, there are many different ways that could be translated back into Arabic. But the word ghurba has a kind of a musical significance also. Firstly, there are at least 2 instrumental pieces with the name ghurba that I can think of. One by Ahmed al-Khatib, the oud player, and another by Reem Ambar, also the oud player. And the word ghurba appears in so many lyrics. You know, it appears in Zarif al-Tul, which is a famous Palestinian folk song. Raih al-ghurba wa baladak ahsan lak. You know, so and the idea of exile is kind of weaved into the music and the lyrics itself, which I think is really important. And part of one of the kind of the deeply held positions of Palestinians in different places of displacement is the idea of return. Now, the word exile doesn't accept that the exile is permanent. You know, it's not kind of hijra. It's not a moving to a place permanently. Exile, I think, implicitly carries the idea that, you know, that exile can be reversed, that Palestinians have the right, at least, to return to the places from which they were expelled. So I think it carries all of those meanings also.
Thank you.
Well, I guess that's it. Thank you so much, Dr. Louise Brehony, for your time and for everyone who've joined us today and for your questions. The recording of this talk will be available on our Facebook page, AUC Press, and shortly on YouTube as well. And I would like to announce that we have the book on sale outside if you'd like to get a copy. And we also have a few of books about Palestine fiction that you will find also published by AUC Press outside. Thanks again for your time. Thank you, everyone.